Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. It's the third week of November. I'm Moon Gan-young, and joining me here in the studio today is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome all to the program. Now, a sudden flurry of diplomacy between South Korea, the U.S., and Japan on the looming termination of an intelligence sharing pact between Seoul and Tokyo dubbed GSOMIA. On this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with our panel of journalists to talk more about various issues surrounding the general security of military information agreement. GSOMIA, the military intelligence sharing agreement between South Korea and Japan, is set to expire at the stroke of midnight on November 23rd after South Korea decided not to renew the agreement back in August. Signed in 2016, it is the first military agreement signed between South Korea and Japan since the Korean liberation in 1945, allowing the two sides to share sensitive military information. Have you written any source, Frank?
Yes, I've covered this, several times as part of some other, mostly video news packages. What I find interesting about some of the coverage that's taking place right now is the sort of nationalist divide that you have. So when you look at Japanese media coverage of this, it'll talk a lot about GSOMIA, but it won't go back to South Korea's request for the dropping of the trade restrictions, certainly not in the headline or the first paragraph. Whereas when you look at South Korea media coverage of this, that will be, either in the headline or that first paragraph. So I think the lines are really drawn on that front. Here in South Korea, though, if you look carefully, you do see some disagreement about how the South Korean government should go about that. And there still is a strong, especially conservative contingent that believes that this issue should be resolved with some concessions from the South Korean government.
Right. Certainly there is a divide in opinion regarding this matter. On August 22nd, the South Korean government announced that it would not be extending GSOMIA, placing the blame squarely in Japan for its decision.
全く次元の異なるものを混同してこういう決定をしていることを断固として抗議をしたいと思います。
Tetsuo, from a Japanese perspective, would maintaining GSOMIA greatly benefit Japan, or would the termination greatly negatively impact Japan?
So I think the extension of GSOMIA is beneficial to not only Japan, but also to South Korea, because it can give a strong message to North Korea and China that we are one. So we are strong. So, of course, there is a historical conflict between Japan and Korea, but so extension of GSOMIA means that Japan and Korea choose stability in the region over historical conflict. I think this is a strong message to North Korean people.
So are you saying that it's more symbolic than practical?
Yeah, it has a very practical meaning because here is the U.S. server, imaginary U.S. server. So Japan can access to U.S. server and South Korea access to the U.S. server. But without GSOMIA, so American administration made effort to not to leak Japanese information to Korean side, so vice versa. So after GSOMIA, so the burden of U.S. will be reduced. So it has very practical meaning.
Now, Oliver, as a specialist or a journalist specializing in North Korea, is that true? Would this be giving off a wrong message to North Korea?
Well, it definitely sends a message to North Korea and China that they can exploit these differences, right? We've seen a lot from North Korea recently about Japan, about essentially dismissing Japan's desire to have summits with Kim Jong-un. And one of the reasons why, obviously, the US was so keen on this agreement was because it was helpful. And as you've said, it does lower the burden for the US. But I think also the problem is that the decision from the South Koreans to withdraw from this agreement really came at a really bad time for the alliance as well, right? And now we're coming up to South Korea's official withdrawal. Combine that with these SMA negotiations, it's not looking good. And I think people always say, well, North Korea benefits from discording the alliance, and that is partially true.
Now, according to a recent survey, more than half of the South Korean public were in favor of Seoul's decision to terminate GSOMIA. Tetsuo, what's the Japanese public's opinion regarding GSOMIA agreement? I mean, are they well aware of this deal? Do they feel that it's necessary?
I think many Japanese people think that extension of GSOMIA is good to Japan in terms of national security. But many Japanese people also think that Japan don't have to rush to improve the relationship with South Korea if Japan was forced to make some kind of concession. This is public opinion. So Japanese government is in the stance of wait and see.
Wait and see.
So also Japanese people also in the stance of wait and see.
Now, South Korea and Japan have failed to narrow their differences regarding the termination of GSOMIA. The Seoul government has taken issue with Japan's export restrictions on South Korea, while the Tokyo government has cited a breach of trust and is demanding solutions on that front. I mean, it's definitely against the universal principle of free trade. But countries, in this case, South Korea and Japan, continue to see historical issues spill over to trade relations, and that affecting national security matters in this case. What are your thoughts on this, mixing trade relations with other issues?
Well, I think really, when we look at what South Korea has done with GSOMIA, they're certainly mixing the issues as well. So it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black a little bit if you say it's just on the one side of Japan. But I think to put this into context, we need to go right back to 1965 and even, of course, earlier and say, okay, that agreement really isn't the agreement to normalize relations and compensation that the Japanese government paid for the colonization of South Korea. Isn't that valid because it was under a dictatorial military government. It wasn't a democratic government at that time. So the suit by the slave laborers of South Korea during Japan's colonial time is somewhat justified. At the same time, they could come up with some type of joint resolution to that, a joint fund that would compensate those laborers, but they haven't done so. I really feel that this is a political football that's being kicked around, and in a way, South Korea is kind of cutting off its nose to spite its face. In other words, its revenge tactics against Japan are serving against its own interests in a way.
Well, in the midst of a deep freeze in Seoul-Tokyo relations, President Moon Jae-in and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe met on the sidelines of the ASEAN +3 summit in Bangkok, Thailand, where they held an 11-minute-long discussion.
Very encouraged while we were there to note that President Moon and Prime Minister Abe had the opportunity to talk, and that's an encouraging sign as we watch the relationship improve.
Now, there are talks of how differently the two leaders pull aside in Bangkok was reported in South Korea and Japan. Tetsuo, do you know whether the issue of GSOMIA was discussed between the two leaders during this very brief encounter?
So I'm not sure, but engaging in dialogue is very important. So Mr. Abe sent, condolences to Mr. Moon when his mother passed away. Also, President Moon sent his personal letter to Mr. Abe through Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon. So I think it is very good to keep talking with each other. But in this case, so I heard a lot of story because a picture was released, right? A picture in which Mr. Abe and Mr. President Moon sat on the sofa and they chatted, but Japanese official did not agree the release of the picture to the media. So one expert said to me that Mr. President Moon tried to show something to making efforts to improve the relationship with Japan because South Korea is under huge pressure of U.S. in terms of extension of GSOMIA.
No, I wonder, why did the Japanese government decide not to release that photo?
I'm not sure, but Japan, as I said to you, the stance of Japan is wait and see. So they don't want to, be proactive. So in terms of solving this issue.
They don't want to be perceived as proactively pursuing some kind of reconciliation.
Yeah, I think so.
Now, following its decision not to renew GSOMIA in August, the South Korean government emphasized that the decision would not affect its military alliance with the United States.
한미 동맹과는 별개의 사안이고 한미 동맹은 끊임없이 공조를 강화하면서 강화 발전시켜 나갈 것이라는 그런 논의도 함께 있었다는.
However, the U.S. has been urging South Korea to revoke its decision to scrap the intel sharing pact with Japan, as Washington worries it would undermine trilateral cooperation.
I can practically guarantee that it will be part of our conversations when we're in Korea next week, but it's something that we would like to see resolved.
Oliver, obviously the U.S. appears concerned about the breakup of military intel sharing between its two key Asian allies in the Asia-Pacific region, that it would undermine the South Korea-U.S. Japan trilateral alliance. Why is the U.S. so keen on keeping South Korea so committed to GSOMIA?
Well, they were trying to build this type of deal for years and years and years. They finally got it under Park Geun-hye, and now it's fallen apart. I mean, the problem is that the U.S. is talking about this as an essential part of this alliance that they have, and I think to some extent it is. It's important for Japan and South Korea to share information, but at the same time it's very difficult for the Americans to be telling the South Koreans about this will harm the alliance, when at the same time you have these kind of slightly bullish tactics coming from the White House about defense sharing costs and things like that as well. We had senior American official just a few days ago talking about how the American people are wondering why we need to have troops in South Korea. So I think for South Korea, perhaps partially this GSOMIA thing was kind of a bargaining chip with the Americans as well, that they could say, well, we're withdrawing from this agreement and we'll reconsider that if you maybe tone down some of your demands. I don't think that seems to have happened, though. So it's difficult. I mean, all of these things have to tie in as well with alliance politics, and it's complicated.
Yes, I would definitely agree. I do feel, though, that the most important aspect that the U.S. is looking at is how this appears to its other sort of, let's say, adversaries in the region and around the world. How does this look to China? How does this look to North Korea? How does this look to Russia in terms of their pressure on those countries? As you have the rise of China, the U.S. sort of wants to present a very united front of its allies in the region in negotiating with China, in negotiations with North Korea. And when you have this kind of split, it really undermines their negotiating position there.
No, South Korea remains firm in its stance that the decision on GSOMIA will not be reconsidered unless there are changes to Japan's export restrictions on South Korea. Do you believe GSOMIA could be extended even with Japan's export restrictions on South Korea still in place?
I think that's a difficult question. And, looking at these export restrictions, we were discussing this earlier, they are not having an economic effect. They are not having an effect on the supply chains here in South Korea yet. Those companies have backlogs of the materials that they need. It's an administrative thing. Those materials have not been banned from export here into South Korea. What is having an economic effect is the political backlash. You have, tourism agencies here in South Korea that are affected. You have, Japanese people that have opened up businesses here that have been affected, that have closed their businesses. You have Japanese businesses that have been affected, but not the ones that are subject to these export restrictions. And that's kind of an irony that's kind of missed in all of this, I feel.
It's almost as if the spillover effect on other industries are much larger than the actual ones targeted, like semiconductors. Now, Tetsuo, are there any indications that Japan could possibly withdraw its export restrictions on South Korea?
Unfortunately, no. because from the beginning, I insisted that there is no impact in making a semiconductor in Korea, because so judging from the list of chemical materials which are under strong control, so I can say that Samsung SK can produce DRAM chips and NAND flash memory as usual. So from the beginning, so I think export control issue is purely in order to prevent from some chemical from being exported to third country. So in 2018, so according to the data of the Ministry of Economy and Industry and Trade, the amount of etching gas which are exported from Japan to Korea, skyrocketed, jumped. So the official of the ministry asked Korean counterpart, so why is this like this? So, but there's no response from Korean counterpart. So based on my interview and based on my story which I heard, so I came to conclusion that it is purely export control, not economic, invasion or economic attack. So it should be separate from GSOMIA issue. Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I'm going to have to disagree with Tetsuya
Yeah.
on that one. I think really it was purely related to the court decision, I think in late 2018, and that's the timing of this. There may have been other excuses. They could have found something else, I think, to levy on South Korea, but I really tie it again to that court decision of slave laborers that the South Korean High Court said these Japanese companies are going to have to pay compensation to these slave laborers, and then you had a response from the Japanese government, one that really, as you mentioned, hasn't really had an effect. But I don't think that the Japanese justification that you mentioned is valid. Other Japanese sources have given other indications that it's related again to this court case and the court decision, and not specifically that export concern.
I mean, I think some Japanese officials have come out and hinted at that possibility as well. And I believe to a certain extent, South Korean government has also released proof of paper that it was not being exported in an unusual way to a third country.
일본은 당초 강제징용에 대한 우리 대법원의 판결을 조치의 이유로 내세웠다가 개인과 기업 간의 민사 판결을 통상 문제로 연계시키는 데 대해 국제사회의 지지를 얻지 못하자 우리에게 전략물자 밀반 출가, 대북제재 이행 위반의 의혹이 있기 때문인 양 말을 바꾸었습니다.
Oliver, tell me, with North Korea stepping up its military provocations in recent months, do you believe agreements like GSOMIA are more needed now than ever? I mean, do you think this will impact the intel sharing gathering of Japan or South Korea?
Well, it certainly creates a stopgap, right? I mean, we had even recent missile tests in recent months. We had South Korea and Japan sharing information. So it certainly makes things more difficult. But again, we often have contradictory reports from Japan and South Korea as well. Japan will say ballistic missile, South Korea will say projectile for whatever reason. I think politics dictate these definitions more than anything else. But yeah, it certainly will impact that. If we see North Korea, for example, testing ICBMs again, which I think is possible in the new year, it will really affect the ability of the two countries to work together in tracking these missiles' capabilities, how far they fly, where they land, which is partially why the US is so annoyed about this decision. Right?
I think really in terms of that intelligence sharing, it's not that important considering what is happening right now. If there was an escalation in North Korea's provocation or a more serious conflict, then it would be much more critical. Right now, in terms of North Korea's missile launches, they can do all this analysis after the fact over time and find out what really happened. It's not that important that they do it within hours or within a day, whereas if there was some type of conflict taking place or more serious provocations taking place over a week's period, it would be certainly more critical.
Now, Tetsuo, how much does Japan rely on South Korean intelligence when it comes to North Korea provocations? I mean, could South Korea's termination of GSOMIA hinder Japan's military intel sharing gathering abilities?
So I think Korean information and Japanese information are complementary. Yeah, because the information which Japan can get is totally different from the information which South Korean spy agency can get. So especially HUMINT. HUMINT is the information gathered by interpersonal contact. So it's a great loss to Japan in terms of national security.
The chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Milley, also expressed hopes that South Korea would extend GSOMIA prior to his visit to Seoul on November 11th. He added that friction between South Korea and Japan would only benefit countries like North Korea and China. Now, if the U.S. is concerned about maintaining close military cooperation between Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, should they not have played a more proactive role in diffusing trade tensions between South Korea and Japan at the onset of this incident?
I think that's a really good point, but I think that both Japan and South Korea had already staked out positions that they couldn't really move from. And, so you had Moon Jae-in and Shinzo Abe, again, stake out positions that they couldn't really move from, even if there was some pressure. And by the time they were really stuck in those sort of trajectories, it was too late for the U.S. to become involved, I feel, and it wouldn't have been effective. It would have been like what it is now, which is too much pressure from the U.S. on South Korea, and Moon Jae-in is not going to look good if he just caves into that U.S. pressure at this time. So you're going to have to see some time go past before they can come to some type of compromise, hopefully, sometime in the new year.
Are we seeing the same kind of pressure from the U.S. to Japan?
Well, I think this is my personal opinion. So we had better look at this, trade control, Japanese trade control against South Korea in the context of trade conflict between China and the U.S. Because U.S. is trying to stop the so-called Made in 2025 in China. So the main point of Made in China 2025 is memory chips. So in South Korea, Samsung and SK have factories in China. They are producing NAND flash memories. So that reason why, I can't go into details. So that reason why, from the beginning, I think that for Trump administration, it is difficult for them to play a role as a mediator between Japan and Korea.
Now, Mark Napper, the U.S. Deputy State Secretary for Korea and Japan, also said that the diplomatic confrontation between Seoul and Tokyo would only serve the interests of China, Russia, and North Korea. Oliver, do you believe the termination of GSOMIA, which perhaps could be translated to a weaker South Korea, U.S., Japan alliance in this part of the world, be a win for North Korea, China, and Russia?
I mean, to some extent, yes. Right. I mean, but I don't really see how much has dramatically changed from before this agreement really existed. We always talk about this being a win for North Korea, but it's difficult to really quantify the practical purposes that this type of agreement has, right? And obviously North Korea has welcomed this agreement, but I think they're welcoming it much more on a political level rather than on a practical level. They're saying, well, we welcome discord between the US, Japan, and South Korea. We don't like South Korea being a kind of puppet of the US, and we don't like South Korea being too close to Japan. So I think they welcome it on that front, but I think talk of this being a massive win for North Korea and a real game changer, I think is slightly overstated.
Yeah, I got to agree with that. I don't think it's going to change the U.S. calculus too much in terms of their negotiation with North Korea. They have a trajectory on their talks and strategy toward North Korea on denuclearization and potential sanctions relief that hasn't really changed too much since they started talking with North Korea. So while this does perhaps weaken their negotiation position, it doesn't fundamentally change it.
So for our final question, of course, if you could summarize today's discussion into a news headline, what would it be? I'm going to start with you, Frank.
Deal or no deal on GSOMIA. How about that?
Deal or no deal on GSOMIA. Tetsuo.
Keep GSOMIA alive. Yeah.
Oliver.
We'll have to see in the new year. If North Korea starts provocations again seriously, then we can maybe have a more practical conversation. That wasn't very brief.
That's a long headline.
That's a long headline.
That is a wrap for our discussion on the impending termination of GSOMIA and its security and diplomatic implications for South Korea and the regional powers. We will be back next week for another discussion on the latest issues making headlines, so don't forget to tune in then. Thank you for watching and goodbye.